But by the mid-1950s, fishers were again considered abundant in New Hampshire, and a regulated harvest returned. Once we had them, we might as well trap them, right? The state has no estimate of the population number, and therefore management is based upon what they call a fisher population index, which is determined from the number of fishers harvested and the trapper catch per unit effort. So how much effort trappers have to put into catching a fisher goes into that index. In 2016, Fish and Game reduced the fisher bag limit from 10 to 5 fishers per season per trapper. And it also came down to 3 in some regions of the state. Their 2015-2016 population index showed increases in some parts of the state. Another interesting thing that they mentioned in that article was that fisher and bobcat numbers have been documented to be inversely correlated in some areas. So in other words, if you have lots of bobcats, you're likely to have fewer fishers, and vice versa. Because they are competitors, approximately the same size and eating a lot of the same foods. This is another Dan Cox photo showing some of the physical attributes of the fisher. Really long tail obviously sticks out, and that's probably where the name fisher cat comes from. They're definitely not a cat, and they don't eat fish, so it's not the best common name. But fisher is the preferred name, although I do hear fisher cat a lot in this area. They're a long, slender animal, 22 to 40 inches long, and that tail makes up about a third of the length. They weigh 5 to 12 pounds. It's a wide range because there's a lot of sexual dimorphism in fishers and most of the weasels. So the males are about 2 times larger than the females on average.
Steve?
Good. Amy and Tim, can you see the picture now?
They're giving thumbs up.
Yes, okay, thumbs up. Okay. All right.
Okay.
Here we go.
Yeah, so I was talking about sexual dimorphism, very common here in the weasel family, and the males being quite a bit larger than females. Their home ranges have been documented at 10 to 20 square miles, and one account says they've been known to travel up to 60 miles per night when they're hunting. So quite the wanderers. Another thing that I find interesting, they have one of the longest, if not the longest, delayed implantation periods. So they breed in March to May, kind of variable, and then they give birth the following February to May after 300 days, or approximately 300 days of delayed implantation. So that egg is fertilized pretty much right away, but it does not implant in the uterus until much later the following winter. So then, of course, then they're breeding, within a month or 2 after giving birth, they're breeding again, and the cycle repeats itself. In the West, fishers are much rarer than in the Northeast. Here's a map of the Western distributions, mostly here along the Idaho-Montana border and into these portions of Montana and Idaho, and then separate subpopulations here in Oregon and Northern California, and even down into the southern Sierra Nevada mountains of California. But here, where we were working, in this part of the Rockies, from Yellowstone to Glacier, very rare. You can see here this part of Yellowstone National Park and southwestern Montana is included in the historical range. This is what their habitat looks like in the northern Rockies. They're highly associated with riparian zones. They like old growth forests with lots of structural diversity. That's also true in our forests around here, which I didn't mention. The structure of the forest seems to be more important than the species of trees in the forest. So they like a lot of vertical structure, which creates habitat for their wide diversity of prey, which includes some of these arboreal species like squirrels and porcupines. The fisher is probably the most efficient predator on porcupines. It uses its extreme quickness, climbing ability to attack the face, primarily the face and neck of the porcupine, and injure it or kill it in that way, and then open it up, flip it over and open it up from the stomach. On the ground, they are known to eat small mammals, snowshoe hares, carrion, they'll scavenge just like a lot of other predators, birds like grouse and turkeys, turkey poults, and then fruits and even fungi are parts of their annual diet. My first and one of my few observations of fishers occurred in 1985 when a friend and I skied into the Shoshone Geyser Basin in Yellowstone National Park. We built a quinzhee and slept several nights in here. And on the first night, we had our food bag sitting up here along with our cooking gear because there was no concern for bears being out at that time. And we were in here getting settled in after dark in our sleeping quarters, and we heard this rustling commotion outside, and we scurried out here with our flashlights and saw a critter bounding away with a 2-pound block of cheese from our food bag heading out across the snow. So we wanted that cheese, so we fumbled around and chased after it, and it dropped the cheese and moved off. But we got somewhat of a look at it there, but we got a much better look a few minutes later when we were settling back down, and it actually came in the entryway of our snow house and sat there a few feet from us. And I had seen enough martens to know by that time that this was not a marten. So I called Don Struble, who was writing a book about small mammals in Yellowstone, and he said, this is an amazing sighting because the only other known record of fishers in Yellowstone Park was a specimen, a skin in the Smithsonian Museum with a tag that said somewhere in Yellowstone, 1896. So this is almost 100 years later when I saw this fisher in Yellowstone. About 10 years later, we were just beginning our surveys for rare carnivores in the northern part of Yellowstone, and we got this photo, which turned out to be very controversial. We thought it was a fisher, short ears, long tail, none of the characteristic markings of a marten, but some people didn't. So again, there were very few sightings or records of fishers in this region. So this spurred a lot of interest and debate. So I'm going to move to marten now, a slightly larger, close relative of the, or sorry, slightly smaller close relative of the fisher. These martens are about 2 to 5 pounds, again, with males being much larger than females. And the distinctive larger ears. Most of them have orange or yellow color on the chest and neck, and a rusty brown color. You can't see the tail here, but it's quite a bit smaller. Uh-oh, here's this box again.
Room.
Okay, so I was here. This is the distribution map for martens, the darker color being the current and lighter color being a historic distribution. So again, here in New England, a little bit in the Lake States, and then down into the Northern Rockies, and a bit here in California, Oregon. Let's see here. As far as their history in New Hampshire is very similar to that of the fisher. They were common, and then they experienced a sharp decline due to deforestation and unregulated trapping. As a result, the state eliminated trapping in 1935. They actually did some reintroductions in 1953, 1975 to try and increase their distribution across the state. And the marten was actually the first species to put on the New Hampshire state endangered species list after it was enacted in 1979, because they were still considered pretty scarce at that time. Since the early 1980s, there is evidence of them coming back, increasing numbers in the state, especially up in the northeast part of the state. As of 2005, and I got this information from the New Hampshire Wildlife Journal issue in 2005, they were known to be recolonizing southward and inhabiting the northern 1/3 of the state. Fish and Game had an update on their website, and they stated there that in 2017, the marten was removed from the threatened and endangered west of New Hampshire and is known to occur from the White Mountain National Forest to the north. Now, some of the factors that could influence how far martens are able to expand are things such as distribution and abundance of fishers. Because fishers are larger, they're seen to be as able to outcompete martens for the same food sources. And then landscape features such as forest fragmentation. Martens require large tracts of undisturbed forest, and also snow depth and condition of the snow. A couple of photos of martens from Montana. This is actually the tail of the marten up here, so this guy's in quite a predicament here. This head coming out of this hole and the tail up here, but they're extremely agile, and it's able to turn around and come back out the top of this stump. Again, showing the some of the characteristics. The ear is much larger relative to the head than the fisher, and the coloration again. All right, our feature attraction, skunk bear, the glutton, the one who steals furs from traps. Many nicknames for the wolverine. This is another Daniel Cox photo, and it is what I call a semi-domesticated wolverine, or wolverine for rent for photography. But I just love this photo because it really shows off the characteristics of this animal. Skunk bear, because it is bear-like in appearance. A lot of people, when they see a wolverine, they think it's a small bear. Obviously, you can tell why. This very stocky body. Look at the size of these feet relative to the legs and the body. And then, of course, it's well equipped with 5 claws, 5 toes, 5 claws on each foot. And I'll talk about how they come into play in a little bit. The Inuit in the far north have a story. There are many stories about wolverines raiding cabins, breaking into cabins, raiding trap lines, stealing animals out of traps, so forth. But the Inuit have a story about a wolverine and a polar bear coming together at a carcass. And they do a lot of posturing and circling. And at one point, the polar bear stands up to show its size and greatness. The wolverine lunges onto the chest of the polar bear, uses these claws to burrow through the chest of the polar bear and extracts the heart of the polar bear and kills it. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but it certainly attests to the natives' opinion of these animals and their reputation for strength and ferocity. This is the worldwide distribution of wolverines across Russia, Mongolia, and into the Scandinavian countries, especially Norway and a little bit of Sweden. And then here in North America, Alaska, Canada, and down into the Northern Rockies, a little bit in Washington, Oregon, and California, but probably not much of a population in those areas. Closer look at North America, historic range in brown here. Again, you can see pre-colonization. They were known to occur across the Great Lakes states and even up through Pennsylvania, New York, and parts of New England. How they got that information, I'm not sure. Possibly from French fur trapping records, possibly from fossils. I'm not sure exactly where that distribution comes from. But again, it was severely constricted due to colonization, trapping, and a war on predators in general, which occurred throughout the West when we were killing wolves and bears with baits and traps and poisons. It also killed off the wolverines. So even though this shows a current distribution into Montana, Wyoming, and Washington, there were none here in the early 1900s. They actually reintroduced themselves in about the 1950s. Wolverines started showing up here in northwestern Montana and Glacier National Park, coming from Canada, British Columbia, and Alberta into that area. So everything, as you see on here in this distribution, was a result of them coming in on their own. Wolverines are primarily scavengers. They have an incredible sense of smell to locate dead things, and then those powerful legs and claws enable them to access buried treasure. This is a site that I found in Yellowstone. This was a bull elk that was buried under 4 feet of rock-hard avalanche debris. After the snow recrystallizes, turns rock-hard. The wolverine dug down. One or more wolverines dug down. This is all that was left, was the skull of a bull elk that was still embedded in this rock-hard snow. Every other bone of the elk was gone, chewed up, eaten. Big pile of hair, no meat, no bones, just this skull was left. So they were able to dig down through, they were able to grind up the bones of this animal with these incredibly powerful jaws. This is what wolverine habitat looks like in Glacier National Park, which is considered to be one of the strongholds of wolverines outside of Alaska and Canada. Here they primarily prey on mountain goats and bighorn sheep, these high elevation grazers that number in the hundreds for each species. In Glacier Park, a lot of times they're scavenging. They're finding sheep and goats that have fallen off of cliffs or have been swept away in avalanches. So they're using that smell to locate these carcasses along the bases of cliffy areas. Farther south in the Yellowstone ecosystem, it looks a little bit more like this, a lot more open meadows, mixed forest and open meadows, lots of elk wintering, and wolverines are preying more on elk, deer, and moose. Now, I should say wolverines are perfectly capable of preying, predating, killing prey in certain situations. They can't, and they don't run large animals down like wolves do. But if they get in a large animal at a disadvantage, say out in the icy river or wading through mud or a swamp, if they can get on the back of one of these large animals, they can use those powerful jaws to bite right through the spinal column and kill a very large animal, many, many times their own size. These wolverines weigh only 15 to 30 pounds, and they can kill a 1,000-pound moose if they can get on its back. In the last program, I noted that I was not a huge fan of radio telemetry unless there was a really good reason to do that. There have been a number of radio telemetry studies of wolverines since 2000. Prior to that, there was nothing. But I'm going to give a couple examples of some really amazing things that have been discovered by using radio telemetry on wolverines. They found pretty quickly that wolverines did not tolerate radio collars very well. They chewed them off of each other. They destroyed them. So most projects went to implanting a radio under the skin, under the belly skin of the wolverine in order for it to stay there. This was a wolverine that was marked by the Wildlife Conservation Society. It was captured in the Teton Mountains in 2008. It then went to Rocky Mountain National Park in Colorado, this arrow here. Across this area of desert and rangeland, the red desert, open grasslands, its telemetry indicated that it stopped and fed on some dead livestock along the way. There were records of it here in Rocky Mountain National Park from 2009 to 2012, and then the batteries in the radio died. 2016, it showed up in North Dakota, from here to here. We don't know the route, but because radio was dead, but we do know that it was here because it was killed by a rancher and identified as the same wolverine. So hardly any mountains along this route, unless it came back here and made a very circuitous route. But the ability to travel hundreds of miles through, ranch lands, open terrain, crossing interstate highways, really illustrates the dispersal abilities of these animals, and kind of gives me hope, for the fact that they can find other habitat, and eventually they may, reestablish populations in places like Colorado and maybe even Utah and Arizona, northern New Mexico, as they once had. Are there any questions so far? I guess I should stop.
Steve, so far, no questions. Everybody's just kind of really taking it in. But I do have a question that came up when you mentioned that it was killed by a rancher in North Dakota.
Yeah.
Any protection across the West for the wolverine?
There have been various attempts to have them listed as a threatened or endangered species, and they have all failed. It does receive limited protection in that there's no longer any trapping. Montana was the last holdout for allowing trapping of wolverines till very recently. But other than that, no specific protections, and the rancher claimed that he thought it was threatening his livestock. So he shot it, and he was not penalized in any way.
Is that a pretty common end to a wolverine's life? I mean,
No.
no. Okay.
No, it's not. We don't know. There's not a lot of data on the ends to their life. I know of one or two that were killed in interactions with bears. But otherwise, sometimes the radios just go dead and there's no way to find the animal or determine its cause of death. And if it's not radio marked, then it's really impossible unless you just happen to come across one somewhere. But roadkills are very rare, and killing of them by shooting them is very rare as well. Another example of a wolverine's abilities took place here on Mount Cleveland. The highest peak in Glacier National Park was documented by the Glacier Wolverine Project and written about in Doug Chadwick's book, The Wolverine Way. This is a male wolverine. The last wolverine was a male as well. M3, he climbed up over Mount Cleveland, ascended 4,900 vertical feet in 90 minutes, according to his GPS collar. This is roughly the route that he took, straight up this steep vertical face of Mount Cleveland. Why did he do that? Because he was on his way to Canada, and that was in the way. So he just did it and went on and off into Canada to the north, and then came back again. So these animals are just incredible in their ability to move and their ability to survive in these, what we consider to be incredibly harsh situations. Okay, the rest of the program, I'm going to talk about the work that we did, Wild Things Unlimited, in the Northern Rockies. And I've got sort of three, what I call sub-projects, just some findings that we gathered along the way as examples of the things that we were doing and learning about wolverines. When we first started, no one else was really doing anything. This was in the mid-1990s. There was one study beginning in Idaho. There had been only one project prior to that in the US outside of Alaska. That was in the 1970s in Montana. But we were breaking some ground here. One of the things we found early on, even though this was not the intent of this project, we learned by methods I'll go into that our data was suggesting that wolverines were avoiding certain what we call managed zones, these areas of timber harvest and roads, and they were preferring unmanaged areas here. This is the same mountain range, the Gallatin Mountains, This is what it looks like on the lower to mid slopes. This is what it looks like along the crest of the range, more of a wilderness character to it. We used snow tracking and cameras for 3 winters. And we called this, this is an orthophoto quad. These red polygons are timber management areas. So timber cuts in various stages of regeneration. These yellow lines are forest roads. No, sorry. Yeah, those are roads. And this red line here is the crest of that mountain range, which I showed in the last photo, alpine, subalpine areas. Cuts across here and extend down to here. So this is what we call the managed zone, and this is what we call the unmanaged zone, where there were no roads and no snowmobiling. Snowmobiling was happening on a road system through all of this, which linked farther to the south, which up here towards Bozeman. So in the managed zone, we had 13 camera stations operated for 664 nights, and we conducted tracking, almost 60 tracking transects that covered 420 kilometers. We had no wolverine detections. That means no photos of wolverines and no tracks crossing any of these transects. In this unmanaged zone, we had 8 cameras operated for almost the same number of nights, and we had only 16 track transects that covered 42 kilometers. However, in that more limited survey effort, we did detect wolverines 14 times with tracks or photos, and we know that these detections represented 3 different wolverines. So and we knew that because we got photos of all 3 of them at one camera station. And this was the beginning of us realizing that we could identify individual wolverines from their markings, especially if you look at the toes. Despite this very distinctive chest marking, this guy or gal has 4 white toes and 1 brown on the right front foot. This one has all brown toes, and this one has white toes on the left front foot. So very nice of them to show their feet. But we learned that way that we had at least 3 wolverines using this area, and perhaps more. This was before DNA sampling was available to us. So this is what we had to work with, were tracks and photos. So very limited sample size and very limited area, but this was beginnings of us starting to understand how wolverines were behaving in this particular area anyway. Any questions on any of that? I went through that figure pretty quickly.
Well, Steve, not so much a question on that, but Kathy's just wondering if there's any readings or research that you might be able to recommend on how you kind of techniques you can use to determine populations of something like wolverine or fisher. She's interested in the fisher population here in New Hampshire.
Oh yeah, there's some fairly old, but still pretty good references that were done prior to a lot of sort of the more recent research. There was a group called the Western Forest Carnivore Committee established in the 1990s, and we would get together and share what we were doing, what we were learning, and that eventually led to the Forest Service producing a couple of basically books, one on the animals themselves, wolverine, fisher, and lynx, and then one on methodologies. And I can send you the reference to that. More recent book, the one I mentioned by Doug Chadwick, The Wolverine Way, talks specifically about the Glacier Wolverine Project. But if you're interested in fishers, that other reference would probably be a good one to start with. It has an extensive bibliography with many other references cited. So if I get your contact information, I can send you.
Steve, if you just send it to me, I'll send it to the whole group, and that way there might be other people who want to read up on it as well. So,
okay. And
we'll include the Wolverine Way. I'll get the information on that, include that in the email as well.
Okay.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, so that's what we learned in that area as we were just getting started. Our surveys were not specific to wolverine. We were documenting bobcats, martens. We had a lot of martens in this area. And other things, although we were specifically looking for wolverines and lynx, we documented every carnivore track that we found along the way. On the other side of that same mountain range, we got involved in a project involving some private lands, some Forest Service land just north of Yellowstone National Park. This is called Tom Miner Basin. The foreground here is part of a 9,000 acre ranch, which is the uppermost ranch in this basin, elevation wise. And these are national forest lands on the upper slopes. And then the boundary of Yellowstone National Park runs along the top of Sheep Mountain and here in the background. So this ranch has been very conservation minded for the last 30 or 40 years. And they hired us to do some work to document activity, wildlife activity on their property and on surrounding lands. We were already doing work on some of the national forest lands. What we found here, one of the more interesting findings was, as stated up here, in low areas of human use, wolverines made extensive use of the remains of hunter-killed big game animals. And that was in the 2005 to 2008 period. So these public lands, the Forest Service lands, are open to hunting. Of course, Yellowstone Park is not. And this ranch allows hunting on some of its lands as well. So a lot of big game hunting, particularly for elk, but also deer and moose to a much lower degree. So again, we use snow tracking as a major method, following wolverine tracks and documenting the things that we were finding along the way. And we were examining these feeding sites. We found these feeding sites because wolverines led us there. This was a camera site, but the wolverine tracks led us to this carcass. Wolverine tracks led us to all of these feeding sites when we were backtracking. In this case, we knew it was hunter killed because the elk skin was neatly skinned and left here by the hunter. In other cases, bones were sawed off. The hindquarters and front quarters may have been missing. They sawed off. There were saw marks. In this case, we believe it was a bull that was shot. This is an extremely dense forest surrounding this little opening. We believe that this was shot, elk was shot and then retreated to this dense cover where it later died. But in 85% or so of the feeding sites that we found, we could find some evidence that they were related to big game hunting. So in this case, a human activity was benefiting these wolverines by leaving carrion that they could then scavenge on throughout the winter. A couple more sites here. This was, again, a hole dug down to the ground level through several feet of snow and nothing but elk hair left here as the wolverines consumed that entire elk body or whatever was left there. This was a skull buried under several feet of snow, and it was old. It was, I'd say, at least 3 to 5 years when this animal died to when the wolverine dug it out. So again, a testament to their incredible olfactory abilities to smell something like that. No meat, no blood, just bone under several feet of snow. Here we are, looking for evidence of hair or scats. By this time, by the 2000s, DNA sampling was beginning to come available. So we did collect hair and scat samples along our backtracking routes. We continued to use cameras, and I believe we were the first people to document wolverine yoga. Shown here, the wolverine pose. And this is another example of the kinds of things we did with our data. This map on these yellowish lands are part of this ranch, the B-Bar Ranch, private lands. It's clear or darker green shade is national forest land. These squiggly lines are wolverine trails, which we documented by following them and using a GPS to document their actual travels on both Forest Service and you can see onto private lands. And then these colored boxes are different wolverines that we identified, the lab identified for us through the DNA samples that we provided. So here, 4 different colors, 4 different wolverines that we identified in this relatively small area using those DNA techniques. So this was significant in a number of reasons. One, it showed wolverines using private lands. Not too many ranches can say that they have wolverines on their properties. And wolverines are typically thought of as that being in that high country glacier, those high wilderness type settings. But we documented that they were using lower elevation lands, private lands, and again, using the remains of hunter-killed animals to survive the winter here. Any
Steve,
questions on any of that?
a couple of questions. Were the wolverines related? Could you tell through their DNA if there was a lineal relationship between them?
They weren't able to do that at the time. They might be getting better at that, but what the labs told me was that you needed a very large sample of known animals to begin to look at lineages like that. So they've been doing that with grizzly bears in Yellowstone because they have thousands of samples now. They have hundreds of known individuals, so then they can start to look for commonality within the genetic markings. But with just a few samples, it's really not possible to do that.
Okay, and here's another question from Susan. She's wondering if wolverines have fur on the bottom of their feet and big feet that get them through the snow, and then do they shed that when they move to a hotter climate?
No, they don't have fur on the bottom. The lynx that I showed you last week is really the only animal like this that has fur on the bottom of the feet. They have fleshy pads and fur on top of the foot. That's about it.
Okay, and one last question about their scat, because this is from me. I love scat, fascinated by it. So they eat the bones. So when you find their scat, are the remnants must look different than other kind of carnivore scat, because are the bones chewed?
Yeah, if they're eating strictly bones, they're ground up into a fine powder, and the scats are white from the calcium of the bones. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Back to the fur, wolverine fur was highly favored by people in the Arctic because it resists frosting up. All other furs will frost when your breath or your body heat warms it, but wolverine fur does not do that. So the Inupiat in particular favorite for the ruffs around their parkas. And this is the third project that I wanted to talk about. This was farther north in the middle of western Montana on the Helena National Forest, where we discovered a high density wolverines that were using atypical habitat. And this was later in the 2000s, over six winters. And by atypical habitat, this is what I mean. I've got it kind of written out here. That means relatively low elevation, more than 2,000 feet below tree line. And previously, the definition of wolverine habitat was above and slightly below tree line, not more than 500 to 1,000 feet below tree line. That wasn't even considered to be wolverine habitat. So here we found them more than 2,000 feet below tree line. This area was also atypical because there was moderate road density and it had multiple human uses, including logging, hunting, trapping, and motorized recreation. So, not high levels of any of those, but consistent low to moderate levels of those types of activities. It had a lot of rocky outcroppings like this. And so kind of a typical view of some of the forest in the region. But I'll talk about how we came to that finding or that conclusion. Again, snow tracking was a big part of that. Wolverine tracks are really cool. If you get them on really good snow like this, you can see clearly the 5 toes, the claws, a heel pad similar to a bear, very unique, foot pattern. They use a variety of gaits. This would be a 4-print loping gait pattern, where it's loping along and all 4 feet are kind of coming down together here. This is more of a 2-print pattern over here, 2-print bounding pattern, which are very common in all the weasels. But over that period, we conducted 70 backtracking sessions. That means we found wolverine tracks, and then we began to follow them using the GPS to document the entire track. And those 70 covered 130 kilometers of wolverine trails. It's extremely slow going to get a kilometer of wolverine trail, because they're leading you through some really crazy stuff, and you're stopping to look for scats and hairs anytime it lays down. You want to look for hair samples. So it's slow going, but it's a really good way to get information. Feeding sites. Here's a trail leading to another feeding site with lots of deer hair. Here are the scats, Susie. Here's what some of the scats look like. None of these are really bone scats, but they have a distinctive, they're really long, kind of generally long, drawn out scats compared to other carnivores. This one might have more bone in it here. It's kind of more of a whitish color in that area. But over that period, we collected 35 wolverine scats, definitely documented as wolverine from the DNA, and 91 wolverine hair samples. So we actually collected way more scats and hairs, but these are the ones that were identified as wolverine by the lab. And that represented 8 different individuals, 5 females and 3 males. So they can identify sex from the DNA material, but that's as far as they can go. They can't get age or a relatedness or anything like that. Some of those hairs were collected, as I said, from day beds and along trails. Others were collected from these gun brushes that we began to use to collect hairs at camera stations. Back to tracking, we found some interesting things through our tracking. Here's a couple of wolverines traveling together, 2 trails going in the same direction. Documented that a number of times. Here's a wolverine following a lynx trail. These are lynx tracks here. Wolverine. This seemed to go both ways. Sometimes when we were tracking lynx, we collected scats, and those turned out to be from wolverines, which was really puzzling. We said, "Are you sure you're identifying that right?" Other times when we were tracking wolverines, the scat we collected was identified as a lynx scat. And we were very puzzled about this, and they assured us they were not making mistakes. This was definitely the trail. And after more and more experience, we began to find tracks of one species actually overlapping the other or walking exactly in the same prints as the other. And it occurred to us that it might be a feeding strategy, that one species might be following the tracks of the other to find a kill site or remains of a kill that they could then feed on. But that happened, I think, 11 times, where we had the scat of one species that was collected along the track of another species. And then sometimes it just appeared that they were out there having fun. This slope is a lot steeper than it looks, but here a wolverine just slid all the way down here on its belly through the powdery snow. This is hard to see what's going on, but these tracks on much harder snowpack, again, very steep here, indicated that one or more wolverines clawed their way up this slope and then slid down here. About multiple times, the tracks showed that they did this multiple times, sliding down here. So sometimes they just want to have a little fun while they're out there. Our cameras began to show some interesting things as well. Again, wolverines traveling together, a couple adults here. And then this is probably a family. You can see a head, probably adult down here and two smaller wolverines here. So 3 wolverines traveling together there. We also documented that reproduction was happening through cameras. There's an adult with a kit and an adult with 2 kits here. Incidentally, this female was missing one eye. This right eye socket was totally grown over by skin and fur, and we have no idea how that happened, but she survived quite well. We documented her for 3 or 4 years, and she survived quite well and raised these kits to maturity. Let's see, we were not really studying them in the summer, but we were doing some other work trying to document wolverine activity around a specific trail, which was the forester was trying to determine if they wanted to increase the size of this trail for motorized recreation. So we were trying to collect data, and we got photos of grizzly bears and black bears, and actually got a couple of videos of wolverine here at this site. To give you an idea how they move. Doing a little marking there, tail up marking, then coming back and going up this tree where we had some bait hanging. And then there was a bunch of blank time, so I cut that out and came back to the same animal a little bit later when he jumps out of the tree and gives us a nice look at the camera. And then bounds off that bounding, loping pattern. It's very, very common way that they move. And back up the tree to investigate the bait. So as you can see, this was on July 4th. We took our cameras trapping to a whole new level. This man, Kalen Bond, first came to one of my presentations and decided he wanted to volunteer on our project. And we later hired him to work for us for several more seasons. He was a wildlife artist, an incredible wildlife painter, but was also very interested in using cameras to photograph wildlife. He did a bunch of research on his own and came up with this methodology developed by Audrey McGowan, who studied wolverines in Alaska. She developed these stands to try and get wolverines to stand up and show us their undersides for individual identification. So we hang the bait up here, we build a little platform and try and get the wolverine to stand up. And a couple more videos here to show you the results of some of that. You see these chest and neck and throat markings. This is how we're trying to identify animals. So getting photographs of that underside of the animal is critical to identifying them. And just a little bit more. I see the animal moves around, gives it one more sniff, and then takes off. One more of these, just because it's a little bit different. Very, very agile, very acrobatic, very strong animals. And very determined. And we had to really wire that bait up there. I thought we could to keep these animals from just tearing it down. But most of the time, our wire job held and continued to lure wolverines into these spots.
graze?
Steve, there's a question about if the videos are available anywhere in public domain for people to see.
No, they're not. I included some stills here. We also used, some cases we used 2 different cameras at the same site to get some still photos, just again to show off the markings and the abilities of these animals. Claws, tail, licking their chops to get to our bait. Gives you another view of the size of these paws, and the little bit of the underside there. So as a result of that, we were able to identify 8 individuals within our study area, which is about 100,000 acres. This represented 4 times the number of wolverines found, to use the entire Yellowstone National Park, 2.2 million acres. The Park Service did a four-year study and only identified 2 wolverines using all of Yellowstone. A glacier, which I mentioned, is a stronghold for wolverines. It probably has about 50 wolverines. This density is 1.5 times the density that they have in Glacier National Park. So when we presented this, managers really were excited. They called this a wolverine hotspot. They wanted as much information as we could provide, and so we did. We shared this widely with the Forest Service and wildlife advocates to bring attention to the fact that this was unusual and interesting. And this is one of the ways we presented that data. Each of these lines is a backtrack recorded by the GPS. Each of these plain dots is a wolverine track, and each of these colored symbols is a wolverine that was identified from DNA. So 8 different individuals represented here in this relatively small area over the course of 5 winters. And very quickly, I'm going to wind things up, but getting back to the notion of this being atypical habitat, but yet wolverines are surviving here. One of the reasons, I believe, is because some of the forests here are incredibly dense and virtually impenetrable to humans. There were times when I had to take off my snowshoes and my day pack and drag them behind me as I crawled on my hands and knees on through the forest to continue to follow a wolverine trail. So, standing up, a human could not walk through the forest, and that happened numerous times. So I believe that this offered a sense of security for wolverines. If they heard a snowmobile or heard a logging truck or smelled a person, they could go into one of these areas and be fairly secure and fairly sure that humans were not going to follow them there. It also had features like this, jumbles of rock outcroppings, and this is the Wolverine Trail. This is, I think, where I probably slid off of this rock, but wolverines took us through these kinds of areas very frequently. This was a very interesting spot, which I'm going to talk about just a little bit more in the time that I have left. A lot steeper than it looks here, but a slash of boulders running through the forest. We found this spot in the winter, and it looked like this. These wolverine trails were leading into holes coming and going from this area. We got really excited. We thought maybe we had a denning going on here, so wolverine denning. So we were very cautious about coming to this area, but we did set up some cameras to try and learn more about what was going on here. And we got photos of wolverines coming and going through this rock pile. And eventually we positioned some cameras to get close-ups when we determined which hole was getting the most use. We set up a camera here. Oops, I'm going to go back there and show you this little video clip of wolverine coming to this site. And then he pops up here. This stick in this position, we put this here, and on the tip of it is some trapping lure made of skunk anal glands and a number of other really stinky things. But this wolverine seems to think it's a nice, delicious, tasty treat. Popsicles for wolverines. We came back the next year in July to see what this looked like, and wandered around here and found the cave. This is the main hole that they were using. We crawled around. We couldn't find any sign and we never got any photos of any young wolverines coming out of here. We monitored this site for the next 3 years, 4 years, 4 winters, and never had any sign that they were using this as a maternal or natal den. So we continue to think about this as we monitored it. Winter and summer, we left the cameras up. We continued to use this. This is towards the end of June. And my last shot here, but well, the other thing we found when we were rambling around amongst these boulders, but there was ice. There was still ice in these crevices and caves in July. So my conclusion, speculation, was that these animals were using this for thermal regulation, that they were using it as a refrigerator to cool off in the spring and summer and fall months. Being below timberline, they were not using the high alpine cooler areas that we normally think of as being cool in the summer, but they were instead using these rock piles that still had ice and were quite cool and able to cool off on a regular basis. So we documented at least one male and one female using this on a regular basis, but as I said, we had no evidence that they were using this to raise their young. Generally, their dens are in serious slash avalanche zones with lots of logs piled up, get covered with lots of snow. The female will have her kits in there by herself to give birth, and then feed those kits until they're big enough to bring out after a month or so. So we got one of what I think is one of our best wolverine still photos at this site as well. So that is my last shot, and can take any more questions if there are any.
Yeah, there's one more question, or Steve, about when you had the videos to get their chest patterns and you baited it, did you get any other types of animals visiting that as well?
Oh, we did. Yeah, we got a mountain lion at this site. So we got bobcats, foxes, skunks. We got quite a few skunks, coyote occasionally. And then in the spring and summer months, we got bears, black bears and grizzly bears.
Wow. And then just one last question about, do male and female wolverines ever den together, or is it just pretty separate?
No, it's strictly up to the female. Generally, one male will overlap 3 or more female home ranges. So the males have much larger home ranges. They will keep an eye. They monitor the females for when they're in estrus, and then they'll breed with as many females as they can within their home range. But they do not share in the denning. They do, however, evidence exists for them traveling and meeting up with their offspring at various points, even as they get older. As they get 2 or 3 years old, there's radio telemetry studies have shown that male wolverines will meet up with their offspring, travel with them for a while, and then go off by themselves again and travel with somebody else for a while. So that degree of sociality was not really known before, and we were only able to learn that through radio telemetry.
Thanks. Yes, Mead. I hear you, Mead. Yes.
Okay. One comment that I'd like to make regarding bobcats and fishers. And we do have many more bobcats now than we used to, and so there's a tendency to try to blame the bobcat on the problems the fisher is having. In the early 70s, it was just the other way around. The bobcat was being blamed on the problems the fisher was being blamed on the problems the bobcat was having. The interesting thing is that I've only seen actually one study that really looked into that. And I wanted to call it to people's attention. In the year 2000, there was a bobcat symposium, and the proceedings were published by the Wildlife Society. And one of the articles in there is entitled Impacts of Reestablished Fishers on Bobcat Populations in Wisconsin. Again, they're trying to blame one on the other or see if there's blame to go around. And I'm not going to read much of it other than a couple of concluding remarks in the abstract. One, impacts of interference competition were not detected. And finally, competition between bobcats and fishers was weak and should result in equilibrium as predicted. So anybody that's interested in the interrelationships between those two species might want to try to get access to that article, and I'd love to know about any other research that's related to that.
Yeah, thanks, Mead. Maybe if you send me the name of the article, the title of the article, I'll include that in the email that I'll send that will have the links to the other things we've discussed today. Yeah, that's really interesting. Thanks for sharing that. And one last question that just came in, Susan, from Susan is, what is there anything that preys on wolverine?
Anything that preys on wolverines? There's actually a fair amount of anecdotal evidence. It goes back to the Muries. Adolf and Olaus Murie studied grizzly bears and wolves, and they, in Alaska in particular, Denali National Park, they had records of wolverines and grizzly bears, wolverines and wolves coming together. And there's other studies that have documented that as well. The Wildlife Conservation Society project documented a wolverine that was killed by a black bear at a carcass. Basically, these animals, these large predators, do not want to get in fights because, they don't want to get injured. They don't want to, reduce their ability to make a living. So there's a lot of posturing generally, but it's very rare that they actually, fight to the death. And certainly nothing that seeks out wolverines as a prey animal. The conflicts, do arise over carcasses and feeding opportunities, but nothing that's going to seek out this animal and try and kill it.
Thanks, Steve. And I'm just paying attention to our time. We're a little over time. It was so worth it, though. I think it's time we'll wrap it up, though, and just say huge thank you to you for sharing your knowledge, your expertise, your incredible life experience, and the photographs and videos. It's just been a real treat for all of us here today. And I'm looking forward to bringing you to the Harris Center for some more talks and more courses. So